I feel like this is gonna sound really weird, but when I go on first dates, no matter who it is, I just feel like I have to talk about being Black.
Hi everyone, my name is Julia and this is Conversations on Race. Our series right now is on being biracial or multiracial. And today joining me is my friend from college and super talented musician, Sharee Nurse.
Hello.
Let's just jump into our conversation.
Cool.
So first off, can you tell me a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a residential life coordinator at Hope College. So I supervise a group of like RAs or residential assistants, and then I also oversee a couple of other buildings on campus. But most of my job is interacting with college students and kind of helping them process and walk through this like undergraduate experience.
Awesome, that's so cool. So there's been a lot of crazy stuff going on over the last couple of months with racism and injustice, and a lot of conversations that people are having that are not always super productive. So my goal with this project is to kind of give people a platform to share their experience of being a person of color, and especially during this time of racial unrest. So yeah, that's kind of the background for our conversation. And I would love to hear your experience, maybe starting out with what is it like for you to be a mixed race person and also a person of color, and what races are you mixed with?
Yeah. So first of all, I love that you're doing this just because I think it's necessary and I think it's really cool. But I am Black and Korean. So my mom is also biracial. She is Korean and Black, but she was adopted from Korea when she was a kid. And then my dad is Black. So more or less, I just identify as either Black or Black and Korean or multiracial. So I think my experience, I guess, in my workplace or here more recently, has kind of been trying to figure out how to identify, I guess, in the spaces that I'm in. So I work at a predominantly white institution. That's been most of my context throughout my life has been like just predominantly white areas and suburbs and schools and things like that. But I think for me, a lot of times I'm like one of the only people of color. And so I think right now in particular, it's trying to figure out how do I bring attention to and bring awareness to what's going on? How do I share my own experiences without trying to like become the spokesperson for all people of color, or all multiracial people or all Black people? Because all of our experiences are really different, even though there seems to be a lot of common threads throughout. So I think right now it's mostly just been trying to figure out how to navigate that.
How would you explain to somebody who's like in the majority group culture and race what it's like to be put on the spot or to be asked to speak on behalf of your whole people group?
Yeah, it's really frustrating, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, because like I said, we all have such different experiences. So even within like the multiracial or biracial community, um, there are hardly ever any like common or shared experiences other than a feeling of like not having a place. And so I think when people kind of put you on the spot, one, it's just like I can't speak for everyone and I don't want to pretend that I know what it's like to be everyone else. But then also, I think with race in particular, but also with a lot of other identity groups, there's this feeling of you're asking me to share my experiences, not as an experience, but as something that could be argued or disputed. And so that's really hard because it's not like you're asking me to like share an opinion on what my favorite sandwich is. Like you're asking me about like real things that have happened in my life, and there will always be the potential that you're going to deny that. And so that's really hard, I think. And then also I think sometimes it's just hard to know if people have tried to do the work themselves. So I think that there's an element of like if we're friends and you're just genuinely asking how I am, that's one thing, and it's another thing to not read any books, to not read any articles, to not really try to like learn what you can for yourself, and to just say, I just want you to teach me all about your life and about Black people or people of color. And so it can be really frustrating.
What would you say, like, it was your experience growing up as a person of color? Because I think a lot of times there's like assumption people have when they see this color of your skin and the culture that you come from. And so they'll kind of make an assumption based off of what you look like, as to what your culture is.
Yeah. So I think growing up there was a lot of self-hate, I think, just because I grew up in white suburbs and was in classes in with mostly all white kids and went to church with all white people. And so there was a lot of like, I didn't have the language for it, but I think that there was this common thread or theme growing up of not feeling not feeling the same or not feeling like enough. I think inside my home was a little different. And I think growing up with a biracial parent also kind of complicated things because I think for a lot of biracial people, there's this like tension or struggle with how to identify or what you identify with most. And so I got a lot of that from my mom. And then I had this like strong like Black presence from my dad. And so like inside and outside of the home were two really different experiences. And inside, I think like being Korean was very important. And even though my mom was adopted when she was a kid, like there's still a sense of like that's a part of my history, that's a part of my culture, I guess. And it's small, but it's still significant. And so I think like at home it was pretty easy to say like I'm Black and Korean, and that's something that I can like cherish and like really hold on to and be proud of. And outside of my home, I think it was really easy to be like, well, I'm not Black enough, or I'm not Korean enough, and I'm definitely not white, and so like I don't have a space to belong or to fit. Yeah, so in terms of culture, like I think I identify a lot with the Black experience. But then when I think about like Black culture, that I don't think was like as strong or as prevalent in my life as like the majority culture around me. So I just got a lot of like comments all throughout my life about like being like the whitest Black person or whatever.
How would you describe to somebody what that feels like to be called like the whitest Black person, or like white on the inside, Black on the outside?
Yeah. Well, I think it's changed for me. So honestly, like growing up, I thought it was a compliment. And that's because I had a lot of shame around being Black. Um, and and so I think that I had like a really negative perception of like who I was and just like my Blackness in general. And I was really ashamed of it. And so when people would like tell me that, it kind of felt like, okay, good, like I'm fitting in. And I think when I got to college, like someone said that to me like the first week that I was at Taylor, it felt like this, not here too. Like I still have to prove myself here. And I think as I grew in my own understanding of my racial identity throughout college, I think more and more I started to get really angry when people would say stuff like that to me, because it totally dismisses or negates the fact that Blackness is a multitude of things, and that and so the feeling that comes when people say things like that is like, it's like, one, I have to then prove myself, whatever my identity is. But then two, it's just like, it's really insulting. It's just like, why would you even say that? What's the point in saying that? It automatically creates this like, so you're saying that like one is better than the other.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes those type of statements make Black culture seem like something that's not accepted. And so like a Black person who has assimilated to white culture is somehow better or more easy to get along with, or something
Mm-hmm.
along those lines, where no culture is really better than the other. And so I feel like those situations can be confusing when somebody says like, you seem white but you're Black, and then it kind of like perpetuates the confusion that comes with carrying like two different cultures and appearing one way in front of people. So going back to childhood, what would you say was your like earliest race related memory? It sounds like you guys talked about culture and race in the household. But do you have like I don't know, any memories of like the first time you realized race was a thing?
I don't know when I first had like the language for it, but I remember the first time I felt ashamed about it was in like the second or third grade when we were learning about like Martin Luther King and civil rights. And I was like, I just remember being in class and one of my white peers pointing out that I was black like them, and then I denied it. And I was like, no, no, I'm brown. I'm brown. Like my skin's light brown. Um, which is really sad and really, I don't know, like frustrating to think about. But it was in, yeah, it was in like the second or third grade that I first remember at least wanting to disassociate myself from my skin color and from my race and culture.
So you mentioned like racial identity came up like when you were in high school and college. Do you feel like there was a point in your life where you kind of became more comfortable with your racial identity?
Yeah, I think that really started for me my sophomore year. And a lot of that development and a lot of that growth and change was because of Felicia Case, who was the director of our Office of Intercultural Programs at the time. And she had started mentoring me. And I had like met her through like a leadership training session and asked to get coffee with her. And we kind of started talking about race just because I knew that was like a part of her role, and I was trying to figure out who I was, I think. But she just really gave me the space to process, but she also gave me the language. Like I think in these conversations, words are such a powerful tool. And she was the first person to really give me like words and language for what I was feeling and what I was going through. And she has three daughters who are all biracial. And so I think that she had an experience of like mothering biracial kids. And so that was really, I think, helpful too. And so having like a mentor to walk alongside me and to be able to say like these are the words that like I'm hearing you say without really saying them, or being able to say like you can identify however you want, but like at the end of the day, like you are black and that is beautiful and that is great. And then also giving me permission to feel angry, because I think that like underneath all of the shame that I had felt for so long, there was also a lot of rage and a lot of pain and a lot of frustration. And she was the first person that I just sat and like just completely like wept with over all of these things that I had felt for years and had never been able to say. And so I think that was like really the start for me of being able to say, you know what, like I've hated myself for so long and I don't need to do that. And it was the first time that I started to, I think, feel some sense of like pride. But it really only came after I could like actually acknowledge and voice the pain and frustration that I was like feeling. And I think by like my senior year, I was really trying to fit into like the activist shoes, and I was like, yeah, Black Power. And really, I think almost like excited for this kind of like reclaiming of my sense of self.
It sounds like an emotional journey, but like a transformation of sorts. Yeah.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So dating can be hard in general, right? It can be, I mean, it's just like a difficult thing to navigate. But I think there's an added element when you are a person of color, especially if you may be a multiracial person. And so you may have two cultures that you're carrying at once, or maybe three, because if you grew up in a different culture than both of your parents, then your outlook on life, the way you talk, dress, behave is shaped by your culture. And so what has your experience been like dating as a person of color?
Yeah. Dating is just a hot mess in general. Um, I think, oh man, I think this is also probably something that it maybe really depends on where you live. Like I grew up in Kentucky and Indiana, which are, I don't know, I feel like nobody really thinks of like open-mindedness and progress when they think of like Kentucky and Indiana. Um, but I think through all of the major points in my young adult and adolescent life, when it came to dating, there have been multiple guys that I liked who voiced that they would not date me because I was Black. And like it happened in high school, it happened in college, like happened last year. I don't know how I keep finding these people, but I think just because like I exist in a lot of predominantly white spaces. And so um, there's like I guess it's like a saying, or I don't know, about people usually fall for people who look like them. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think you fall for people who you're just around the most. And so, like, for a lot of white people, like, that's who they interact with. Like, if you are a part of a majority culture, like, that's who you're going to be around, that's who you're used to. For me, like, I was always around white people. So I just had a lot of crushes on white guys, and some of them were great, some of them were hot garbage. But I mean, part of that is like I don't know. I've had people who I didn't know would respond that way. Like we were good friends. And this is stuff that I didn't really talk about in high school. So it's not like I ever really had a chance like before then, before those conversations to figure out, oh, hey, like maybe they're not the best person for me to date or interact with or whatever. And then like eventually this point would come where they'd be like, I think you're great, but like I just am like not into Black girls, or I just wouldn't date a Black girl. And it's like I think it was really confusing for me just because I was like, I don't understand where like the disconnect is. Like I think there's a difference between like saying like I'm just around these kinds of people a lot more, and so this is what I'm used to, or like I don't know. But I don't buy it. Like I don't think it's a thing. I think it's like you grew up in a culture that like didn't teach you to care or value other people who look different than you, or you weren't taught that like other people were also beautiful, or you're just scared. Like I also had girlfriends in high school who like wouldn't date Black guys because of their parents, and I remember like hearing them talk about it, and there was always this excuse of like, well, I'm just not like attracted to them, or like my parents just won't let me. And that's one thing, but I think even outside of that, like the guys that I have dated, so my first like real like serious relationship was in college. It was in like 2016, so during the election, and I was dating a white guy, and that was that was really interesting because he was great. He was a great person, very supportive. But I remember us having a conversation, and I was like, "You know that I'm Black, right? Like, you know that." And he was just like, "What? Like, where is this coming from?" And I just was like, I just need to process this, and I don't know how to talk about it, and I don't know how to talk about it with you." And so I think there's like always this feeling that comes, whether it's like just going on a few dates or being in a relationship. There comes this moment where it's like, this is a part of my life, and this is something that I need to talk about, and I don't know how you're going to respond, unless we had like some long history or long friendship of like being able to have these conversations and stuff. So it's hard to like navigate. And also, don't get me wrong, there are like a lot of really great guys out there. So like I don't know, I've dated guys who have had ease like talking about this stuff with me, and that's been great. And so I think dating can just, yeah, it can be really hard. I feel like none of that was coherent, but
I think what that captures is the complexity of it, and the difficulty in, especially what you mentioned of like having to ask the person like, don't you know that I am Black too? Like if they may be talking about a certain people group. And when you mentioned that, it reminded me of someone I was talking to recently who said when they're with their white friends that their white friends will say stuff about Black people, and this person was Black, and so they almost feel like they are not recognized as a Black person around those people.
like I feel like, okay, I feel like this is gonna sound really weird, but when I go on first dates, I think no matter who it is, I just feel like I have to talk about being Black. Like I have to mention it on the first date, just because I don't want to waste my time, like I don't want to date somebody who's really nice. Like you can have really, really nice people who just like do not have the capacity or understanding to be able to go there and like talk about those things. And so I just feel like on every first date, like I have to just mention it, whether it's like a joke or it's like some comment on something political or whatever. Like I just need to be able to like almost like in another way say like, hey, I just want you to know that I'm Black. So Yeah, like I never want it to be a surprise. I don't want to date somebody for weeks or months and then start talking about it and have them be like, "You've changed," when really it's like, no, like I didn't know that I could talk about this stuff with you.
You mentioned there's a lot of difficulties with being a multiracial person and then like a lot of self-hate, like growing up confused. Would you say that there are any benefits to being a multiracial person?
I think so. I mean, I think it's cool. You get to participate in different cultures, you know. Like it's really fun for me to, in some spaces, feel Black, and to say that proudly and to connect with other Black people on that. But then it's also really meaningful for me to, I don't know, participate like with my mom and also feel like I'm Korean and like that's really fun. And like me and my mom were trying to like learn Korean together for a while, and that just was very like meaningful for me, and it's really cool. And I think that you get a different perspective too. And a lot of this, like honestly, I do think is shaped by like how you're raised and where you're raised, because again, not all like multiracial people are the same. But I think that it gives you a perspective, and I think it, for me at least, it feels easier for me to hold tension, in a lot of ways. And I feel like I have maybe a little more patience, not a ton, but a little bit, I think, when it comes to conversations on race being really hard for people, just because I don't know, I get it. Like even when I think about like my mom's family, her adopted family, like they're all mixed up. Like we've got Black people, white people, like my grandma has like brown hair and green eyes, light skin. Like they're, I don't know. So I feel like I feel like being multiracial gives you different perspective and gives you, I think, an ability to fit in a couple different places and to kind of see life from a couple different perspectives.
What like words of wisdom or like what would you tell yourself growing up, like or a young woman who's multiracial, confused about her race, like what would you say to them?
I'd probably just say to stop hanging out with people who say racist things. Like the stuff that I justified is so upsetting thinking about as an adult. Like I think I just gave people a lot of grace maybe, or maybe just excuses, and I think that cost me something in the long run. So I think for multiracial people especially, it's really really important to like find friends that make you feel like all of you is accepted and that all of you is something to be proud of. So like for me specifically, like I would have told myself to find other Black friends like earlier. And I did, like I had a couple growing up, but I think I would have told myself to like lean into that a little bit more instead of holding on to this shame and trying to just fit in with all of the white kids around me. And I think I probably would have told myself to also find a, a Black mentor, because I think that mentors in general are just so important. So I think that I think those would have been my biggest things. Yeah. And to just like love yourself and recognize that there is beauty, in you even when other people don't see it.
One thing that you mentioned that I've been thinking about a lot is not tolerating racist statements or like yeah, don't not being around people who say racist things. As an adult, do you feel freed up to call people out when they say something that like is either super ignorant or like blatantly racist?
I think it depends on the space. So like if I am in a predominantly white church with a lot of old people who are like really, really conservative, that just feels like something where it's like, yeah, I just don't need to be here. Like, I don't, it's just, it's not worth it. And I think there are other spaces where it's just like, yeah, you don't know what you don't know. Like, some people just have never had to have these conversations. And so I think there's a little more room for some like, I don't know, teachable moments or grace or whatever. And so I think that in those spaces, it feels a little easier to say like, hey, like this isn't okay. And like this thing happened, or you said this thing, or you didn't say anything. And that was really frustrating or really hurtful. And this is the impact that it had. And I think that that feels, I don't know, like an easier space to kind of call some of those things. But yeah, it really depends. And it depends on like my relationship with people too. Like if it's a relationship that I want to to be a part of, or one where this person in every other area has like really cared for me and really tried to be there, then I think I'm a little more likely to say like, hey, like this was a thing again that hurt, and to be able to say that. But so yeah, I think it depends on the space, but definitely like I do feel like as I've gotten older, I do have more of a sense of like agency in those moments, and being able to say like, yeah, I'm not doing this. Like especially if it's public, like I think it's one thing for me to be insulted or offended by a person in passing, or like a small group of people where it's like that was really stupid, but like whatever, I don't care about this. But when it's like public, and especially when it's somebody who's in it like a position of power or authority, like that's something where I do feel like both a desire but also like a sense of obligation to call it out, because I think that that's incredibly dangerous to say really ignorant things to a mass of people. So in those places, I think I feel a little bit more courage maybe to say like, hey, that ain't it. Like that ain't it. So
yeah, I feel like I'm being challenged more and more to like be freed up to speak out against those type of things, because like you said, it depends on the situation for sure, and like maybe your relationship with the person who has said such and such statement. But my team at work, we're going through a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so a lot of it is talking about like educating the people around you, or like being free to explain to somebody why what they're saying is hurtful and not helpful. But most of the time I just let those things slide, because I'm like, you know what, they don't know it. I don't feel like explaining it to them. But yeah, I'm working through that, figuring out how to say it in a way that's helpful.
yeah, I think it's definitely like, I think there's a fine line. Also, I just want to like, my example was about like conservative Christian churches, and I just want to say I know that there are also very racist liberal people. I just feel like I could get in trouble for saying that, but I also don't really care that much. But I just want to say like I know that anyone can be racist, I guess, any white people. Yeah, no, I think it's a fine line, and I think that a lot of it also comes down to like a sense of responsibility maybe. So like for me, like my workspace is a very different space than like where I go to church or the people that I hang out in my social life. And so like when I think about my students that I supervise, especially like if I know that there's a colleague of mine who is saying like really ignorant things, or just saying really like racist things, that's a space where it's just like, even if I don't want to call that out, I want to be protective of my students, and especially my students of color. And so then I feel like more of a sense of like I need to say something, and I want to say something. And so I think that like it's definitely a personal decision, and it's a fine line for the people who are like the ones holding that marginalized identity. I think it's really different when you're like person in the majority who's like, I'm tired of having these conversations. Like that's really different. I think that probably the biggest thing that I'm learning is honestly when to check out. And so I say this for people of color and not for white people specifically in this conversation about race. But I think that the burden for education and for growth and change and whatever falls on people of color or Black people. And that can be extremely detrimental to our health. And so I think that for me right now, because this is like a conversation that shows up everywhere in my life, it's really critical for me to be able to pay attention to and identify when I'm feeling tired and when I'm feeling like I'm starting to get burned out, and to kind of take a step back before I actually reach burnout. And so I think like that's honestly the biggest thing that I'm learning. Like I started following the Nat Ministry on Instagram, and I really appreciate them, but it's all about how rest is a form of activism, and I think that that's really helpful for me and hopefully for other people of color.
Awesome. That's so cool. Well, we're going to wrap up, but thanks so much, Sharee, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.